What's going on, YouTube, and welcome to Goal Line Hockey. It's Kevin Forte, and we are going to wrap up our playoff previews here in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. Make sure to check out the rest of our playoff previews. We're going to be finishing it up in the Central Division against the number 2 seed Dallas Stars and the number 3 seeded Minnesota Wild. The Minnesota North Stars matchup, that's right. It's going to be a good one. There's going to be a little bit of blood, a little bit of hatred between these franchises. We're going to see that on full display in the Stanley Cup playoffs. So between these two teams, both of them matched up fairly well against each other. Each of them picking up a pair of wins against each other in their 4 matchups. So a pretty even series during the regular season. In terms of the injury front for the Dallas Stars, really not too bad. They don't seem to have any injuries to report. That's great news for them. For the Minnesota Wild, there was a sense of excitement because, all right, good. We're getting Kaprizov back from that injury a couple of weeks ago. Great stuff. And then Joel Eriksson Ek goes down, and it looks pretty bad. I do not think we will see Joel Eriksson Ek. He's listed as week to week with a lower body injury. So some awful news on the Joel Eriksson Ek front. We're not really sure what's going to happen with Mason Shaw. He suffered a torn ACL. I would assume that he's not playing in this, at least in the first round. And Oscar Sundqvist, I believe, took a maintenance day as well with Joel. On the same night, Joel Eriksson Ek got hurt. So he did not play in their game Thursday. So I think he's going to be kind of a game time decision, but I would expect Sundqvist at some point in the series. The real injuries here are Eriksson Ek and Mason Shaw for the Minnesota Wild. Other than that, completely clean slates for both sides. In terms of this, kind of going into this series for both of these teams, the Minnesota Wild were out of the playoffs, right? Everybody was saying, they're not going to make it. Then we get to the trade deadline. Bill Guerin makes his moves. He brings in a couple of veterans that have been there before. A guy like Marcus Johansson, really great fit there. They've brought in some guys like John Klingberg, former Dallas Star, so that's kind of interesting. Maybe he scores an OT winner in one of these games. They made some really interesting moves, like bringing in Sundqvist, like Gustav Nyquist. They've brought in some guys that I think are going to help them in a playoff run. And when I look at the Minnesota Wild, the emergence of guys like, shout out to his new contract, Freddie Gaudreau, the Joel Eriksson Ek of the world when healthy, Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Zuccarello. This Minnesota Wild team is not a pushover, and I think they're one of the teams that you really have to watch for in this year's playoffs. Now, looking at the Dallas Stars, they had a really good start to the season. Jake Ottinger was playing out of his mind, kind of following up from last year's playoff run. And then things kind of started to drop off in December. They played the Rangers in one game in particular. I think a lot of Dallas Stars fans will agree with me on this point. They played a game at Madison Square Garden on their road trip. They were up 1-0, and I think, who was it? I think Keandre Miller scored with like less than a second left in the game. And then the Rangers won in overtime. And I think ever since that game, the way that my perception and the way that the team has looked in Dallas has been very different. And they've looked way more vulnerable, way less threatening. And I got to be honest, a little bit worrisome for the Dallas Stars, really, since that game. And when I go into this series, I look at who has been the hotter hand, and it's been Minnesota. Dallas has known they were going to make the playoffs. They've been the higher seeded team for most of the year. And I think they kind of went on cruise control into the playoffs. Minnesota, it didn't seem like they were that way. They played really well down the stretch. A lot of fights, a lot of aggression. The Minnesota Wild have been playing playoff type hockey for the last couple of months. They are ready to go for this. And I think it's going to be a real challenge for the Dallas Stars on game 1 through whatever it goes to. In terms of forwards, defense, goaltending, I like to do those matchups. Forwards-wise, I like the Minnesota Wild. I got to be honest. I think the Dallas Stars really could use a little bit more help in the bottom 6. I think the Minnesota Wild really made a point to get better in that category at the deadline, bringing in the Johanssons and the Nyquists and all those guys. I think that really makes a difference for them. For the Dallas Stars, they've got some very good guys up front, like top heavy, and then the fat kind of trims really quick after that. So I don't really know what's going to happen with the Dallas Stars' depth. Can they score like they did a couple years ago, getting some weird freaky deaky goals from Joel Kiviranta and and those in Joel Lesperance, like you kind of need those performances to get you past the Minnesota Wild offense. And I'm just not sure we're going to see that. Defensively, I'm also going with the Minnesota Wild. I think it's definitely tough with Dallas because they've got Miro Heiskanen, who is a very good defenseman. But I think, again, you're looking at X factors that were picked up at the deadline. I really think John Klingberg has been a really interesting match there for the Minnesota Wild. He's a good puck-moving defenseman, and I think that the Minnesota Wild, they know what they have in this guy. I think that overall that defense is very loaded. I know people have their thoughts about guys like Kalen Addison and Alex Goligoski, but that's really good depth that they have. Like, those are guys that, God forbid there's an injury or two on the blue line, those two guys, Addison and Goligoski, can both slot into the lineup. Maybe not perfect fits, but they can slot into the lineup as really solid depth, and I think you're going to need that in this type of series, the way the Minnesota Wild play. The way, I always forget their head coach's name, Dean Evanson, the way he coaches, very physical, tough. They need as much depth as possible, and I think they get that with some of the guys they have, even on the bench or up in the press box. Goaltending, in terms of who has been better, like performance-wise here the last couple months, it's no doubt Minnesota. I think the emergence of Gus Bus, Philip Gustafsson, has been really, it's incredible what he's done. With that said, in a franchise, like if I was playing franchise mode and I needed one goalie or the other, am I picking Philip Gustafsson or Jake Ottinger? I mean, you're on drugs if you aren't taking Jake Ottinger. Like, Jake Ottinger has more potential and capability than a guy like Philip Gustafsson, but you look at how things have gone here the last couple months. What have you shown me recently? I'd give it to Gus Bus. Shout out to Gus Bus and the Minnesota Wild. So I'm going with Minnesota in terms of goaltending. And I know that Dallas Stars fans will disagree with me because believe me, in terms of a better overall goaltender, it is definitely Jake Ottinger. You don't have any questions from me on that. But the way performance-wise they played here going into the postseason, I'm going to go with Philip Gustafsson. So with that all said, I think this is going to be a really good series. I'm really excited to see how these two teams match up head-to-head. But I have to go with this going to 7 games, and I'm going with the Minnesota Wild. I think the Minnesota Wild are going to surprise some people in this year's playoffs. I think Dallas kind of just cruise controlled their way into the postseason this year. Jake Ottinger isn't at his level that we really have seen from him in a while. He's just not at that level that he needs to be like he was last year. If this was last year, Jake Ottinger, I think he single-handedly could win them this series. I just don't think he has it right now. Philip Gustafsson's been hot. One of the best goalies in the league. If he's played more games, probably in the conversation for the Vezina Trophy. Like, seriously, look at his numbers. It is something to consider. And I think he's going to surprise some people in this year's playoffs. I think Gus Bus and the Minnesota Wild get past the Dallas Stars in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs in 7 games. So that is it for our playoff predictions videos. Guys, make sure to check out the rest of my playoff previews, as well as make sure to check out our NHL bracket challenge, which is team_GLH. That's team_GLH to join our bracket challenge here before the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. Can you put together a better bracket than me? We'll find out in our bracket challenge, so make sure to check that out as well. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay tuned for the rest of our videos here as we are in playoff mode. So make sure to subscribe to the channel for the latest NHL news. Guys, that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Peace.